Welcome to the Conservation Corps North Bay Training Module number 7, which deals with the concept of climate. Since we're working on module number 7, you should have the training module worksheet number 7 in front of you. The module worksheets, as I've said at the beginning of every module, are an important part of your training and are intended to serve as outlines of the training modules and their content. The worksheets contain several questions or prompts that will require you to respond in writing. I realize that writing does not come easy to everyone and at times can be a difficult task. However, it does present an opportunity for you to engage the material in a deeper and more thoughtful way, and also allows you to share your own particular insights and takes on things. The worksheets, of course, are in no way intended to be tests or exams to see how well you understood the material. There are no right or wrong answers or responses to these questions. It's only your thinking and your synthesis of the material that's important. You're not graded or judged on your responses. Your reactions, the purpose of your reactions are to extend your thinking and allow you to dive deeper into the material. I strongly suggest upon completion of the module that you share your written responses with a colleague, a supervisor, or someone so that you can bounce your ideas off of someone and share them. And they may contribute to also increasing the effectiveness of the training. Well, okay, so we're going to talk about the concept of climate, which in my opinion is probably the most important concept that a supervisor can have in their toolbox. But let's get started and we'll see. Well, speaking of communication, I'm going to play about a 2.5-minute video for you just to show, to get a little laugh about communication, first of all.
As long as it's okay with the audience. Crazy about baseball. Will you stand still? Pick up your hat. Go pick up your hat. Then you'll go and petty your popcorn and don't interrupt the act anymore? Yes, sir. All right. You know, strange may seem they give ball players nowadays very peculiar names. Funny names? Nicknames. Not as funny as my name, Sebastian Dinwiddie. Oh, yes. Funnier than that? Oh, absolutely. Yes. Now, on the St. Louis team, we have who's on first, what's on second, I don't know who's on third. That's what I want to find out. I want you to tell me the names of the fellas on the St. Louis team. I'm telling you, who's on first, what's on second, I don't know who's on third. Do you know the fellas' names? Yes. Well, then who's playing first? Yes. I mean the fellow's name on first base. Who? The fellow playing first base for St. Louis. Who? The guy on first base. Who is on first? What are you asking me for? I'm not asking you, I'm telling you who is on first. I'm asking you who's on first. That's the man's name. That's whose name? Yes. Well, go ahead and tell me. Who? The guy on first. Who? The first baseman. Who is on first? Have you got a first baseman on first? Certainly. Then who's playing first? Absolutely. When you pay off the first baseman every month, who gets the money? Every dollar of it. Why not? The man's entitled to it. Who is? Yes. So who gets it? Why shouldn't he? Sometimes his wife comes down and collects it. Whose wife? Yes. After all, the man earns it. Who does? Absolutely. Well, I'm trying to find out is what's the guy's name on first base? No. What is on second base? I'm not asking you who's on second. Who's on first? That's what I'm trying to find out. Don't change the players. I'm not changing nobody. Take it easy. What's the guy's name on first base? What's the guy's name on second base? I'm not asking you who's on second. Who's on first? I don't know. He's on third. We're not talking about him. How did I get on third base? You mentioned his name. If I mention a third baseman's name, who did I say is playing third? No, who's playing first? Stay off of first, will you? What do you want me to do? Now, what's the guy's name on third base? What's on second? I'm not asking you who's on second. Who's on first? I don't know. He's on third. There I go, back on third again. Well, I can't change their names. Will you please stay on third base, Mr. Broadhurst? Now, what is it you want to know? What is the fella's name on third base? What is the fella's name on second base? I'm not asking you who's on second. Who's on first? I don't know. Third base. You got an outfield? Oh, sure. See?
Well, okay. That's just sort of a classic video. And of course, the idea is communication is a very complicated process. Well, we've discussed in prior modules interpersonal communication as such an extremely important skill set, and it can be enhanced by strategies that we've already talked about, by being open to giving and receiving feedback, being willing to share or self-disclose, by engaging in relationship building techniques like active listening, engaging in positive conflict resolution strategies like delivering I messages instead of you messages, or looking at you win and I win strategies, or the types of social authority that we engage in. Now, another really important concept that greatly enhances effective communication is the context or the climate that the communication takes place in, or what is referred to as communication climate. This module will present this powerful tool of communication climate and discuss the implications of various types of communication climates on the effectiveness and ineffectiveness of interpersonal communications. And as I said before, an understanding of this concept of communication climate might be one of the most important skills that a supervisor can have in their toolbox or in their arsenal of strategies. Now, there is a malady which is called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, S-A-D. And it is actually a clinical depression as a result of a lack of sunshine. And consistent gloomy geographic climate conditions can negatively affect a person's mood. So the actual climate and the amount of sunshine can affect a person's mood, and it's actually in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual listed as a malady. And this seasonal affective disorder affects about 1.4%, almost 1.5% of the people who live in Florida, and about almost 10%, 9.9% of people who live in Alaska, which makes sense because there's a lot less sunlight in Alaska. But the point is that the actual geographical climate can affect each of us emotionally, psychologically, and physically. So the geographical climate can affect us. Well, interestingly, just like the weather can affect our emotions and moods and behaviors, a similar effect can be found in our interpersonal and working relationships. The prevailing climate or emotional tone in which our interpersonal communication takes place is referred to as communication climate. And this climate affects how satisfied we feel about the relationship we are interacting in. And communication climate, as you can see on the screen, can be defined as the dynamic, short-term atmosphere and general motivational tone surrounding a social interaction that affects the intra and interpersonal communication patterns of the actors within the social interaction. Now that's a mouthful, but it just means that the prevailing atmosphere or tone that develops in a communication is referred to as the communication climate. And that climate can affect the behaviors of the people who are acting inside of it. In some relationships, we really feel good or valued or not threatened. And this is a comfortable, supportive climate. In other relationships, we may feel defensive or threatened, under attack, personally diminished, and we may react defensively. These two terms, supportive and defensive, describe the communication climate, which is made up of a constellation or pattern of behaviors. So supportive relationships are characterized by certain patterns of behaviors, and that tend to make us feel good and valued and not threatened. Defensive relationships or climates are characterized by patterns of behaviors that tend to make us feel defensive, threatened, under attack, personally diminished. The words patterns of behaviors that are underlined on your screen, it's an important concept. A few behaviors, one or two, do not create a communication climate. It takes a pattern and extensive frequent use of certain behaviors that leads to the establishment of a communication climate. And these climates tend to become either supportive or defensive in nature. Now, Jack Gibbs, who was a psychologist in 1961, identified 6 patterns of behavior that tend to create defensive communication climates and 6 patterns of behavior that tend to create supportive climates. And we're going to take a look at each of these 6 defensive climate patterns and 6 supportive climate patterns, and they're listed on your screen. The defensive patterns of behavior that may lead to defensive climates are evaluation, control, strategy, neutrality, superiority, and certainty. So patterns of behavior that tend to be evaluate or control or are strategic or are neutral or indifferent or superior or certain will tend then to create defensive climates. And patterns of behaviors that are descriptive or problem-oriented or spontaneous or empathic or based on equity or are provisional tend to have supportive climates, tend to create supportive climates. So we're going to talk about each of these defensive and supportive climate patterns. Well, okay. Now first, we have the defensive climate pattern that is evaluative in nature. Evaluative in nature. And people who are working in an evaluative climate tend to feel judged or evaluated all the time, feel blamed, feel under pressure not to make mistakes, feel fearful of being wrong. And they tend to respond with a counterattack because they're defensive. They tend to try to justify their actions, why they're doing what they're doing. They become defensive. They're afraid to take risks or try something new. They turn inward to protect themselves, and they abandon communication. They stay away from communicating. Now, to counteract this evaluative climate pattern, there is the descriptive climate pattern. And people who are working in a descriptive climate, unlike people who are working in an evaluative climate, tend to feel that they are not being judged. They feel that they are of value and are not being blamed. They feel open to feedback and sharing or self-disclosure. And how they respond to this descriptive pattern, they're more willing to take chances, to try new ideas. They use making mistakes as a chance to learn rather than being concerned about making mistakes. They're more open and transparent. And they use descriptive rather than evaluative language. So we have an evaluative defensive climate pattern, and to counteract that, there is a descriptive supportive climate pattern. And we have tools that we can use to move a climate from being evaluative to more descriptive. And we'll discuss those concepts later. The second type of defensive climate is one that is based, the patterns are based on control-orientated. And people who are working in a climate characterized by control patterns tend to feel manipulated by others, feel that someone is trying to control them, feel that they must protect themselves from being controlled, and feel solutions are imposed on them and their input doesn't count because they're being controlled. And they tend to respond to this pattern less willing to collaborate They're looking to win. They're looking for I win situations because they're defensive. They're less open and transparent. They tend to withhold and share less, and they are less open to receiving feedback. Now, to counteract the control-oriented pattern of defensive climates, we have a problem-oriented pattern, which is under supportive climates. And people who are working in a climate characterized by a problem-solving orientation tend to focus on the problem, tend to offer suggestions or give feedback, feel that they are part of a team, and how they often respond in this climate. They tend to collaborate for acceptable solutions to everyone. They're focused on win-win, both parties winning as opposed to I need to win. They're more open, transparent. They'll share more, disclose more, and are much more open to receiving feedback. So the defensive orientation here is control-oriented, and the supportive counter pattern is problem-oriented. Okay, a third set of climate. Defensive is where there is an emphasis on strategy. And the supportive one would be an emphasis on spontaneity. Now, I want to have a word about strategy here. The way strategy is used here is not strategy in the sense of a series of steps to solve a problem or a plan to solve a problem. Strategy here means a secretive plan to manipulate or influence others. So a climate that is strategic, that is based on a plan, causes people to be in a defensive pattern. And people working in a climate characterized by strategy tend to feel manipulated, feel there are hidden agendas. They tend to feel suspicious. What do they want? How will they get it? And feel that they can't really trust the other people. And they tend to respond when they're in this pattern of a climate that's based on strategy. They will withhold information. They're not going to share very much. They use caution when communicating. They're trying to be very careful because they're not quite sure what's going on. They're not open. They tend to be closed and secretive, and they become afraid and defensive. Now, to counteract a defensive climate built on patterns of behavior that have strategy behind them is the supportive climate and the patterns of behavior with an emphasis on spontaneity. And people working in a climate characterized by spontaneity tend to respond in the following manner. They're more open and transparent. They tend to self-disclose more often. They're more honest, genuine, have no hidden agendas. They focus on the here and now as opposed to what is past. They use open communication with no agendas and are more willing to take risks, share opinions, and look for common solutions. So these are the defensive climate on strategy and the counteracting supportive climate based on spontaneity and the effects that they have on people who are working within those climates. Now here we have, under the defensive climates, a climate based on neutrality, neutral or neutrality. Now, a word about neutrality. The way it's used here, it does not mean being neutral. It refers to being apathetic or indifferent. So a climate that is characterized by patterns of behavior that tend to be apathetic or give off a sense of indifference. People who are working in those climates feel the climate is impersonal, indifferent, apathetic, feel that others have a whatever attitude or I don't care, feel there is a lack of concern for others or a lack of concern for themselves. Now, to counteract the defensive climate pattern that is based on neutrality, we have the supportive climate patterns that are based on empathy. People working in a climate characterized by empathy tend to respond in the following ways. They display real concerns for others. They're very empathic. They use active listening skills. They really want to understand others and communicate effectively. They value others' opinions. They engage in taking other perspectives. What does it look like from the other person's perspective? They use supportive language, and they display more openness and more transparency. Another set of climate. We have defensive climate with an atmosphere of superiority. This is a climate that's based by patterns of behavior that give off an atmosphere of superiority. And people working in a climate characterized by superiority tend to sense a them versus me competition going on. So it's them against me or me against them. They feel there are insiders and outsiders, and they feel as an outsider. They have a feeling that they are beneath others. Since the climate pattern is based on giving off the idea of superiority, those of us acting in it tend to feel inferior. And they tend to have the idea that the people in charge are saying, I'm someone and you're not, you're nothing. Now, to counteract that defensive climate pattern of superiority is the supportive climate pattern based on equity and equality. Now, a brief discussion of the terms equity and equality. Equity means to treat everyone the same. Equality means to treat everyone exactly the same. Equal treatment. Equity means to treat others in a fair way that meets their individual needs. At times, treating everyone equally may not be the best solution to a situation. Treating people according to their needs may be more appropriate. Here's an example. Here, 3 people watching a baseball game. Each of them is treated equally. They each have the same exact box to stand on to look over the fence. But of course, this young person right here can't see, even though everyone is being treated equal. Here, this is equity. Everyone is not being treated equal, but everyone is being treated in such a way that it's based on their particular needs at the time. So that's the difference between equity and equality. So we don't necessarily want to always focus on treating people exactly the same, but focusing on treating people in terms of what their specific individual needs are and what is fair. All right, so back to the atmosphere patterns of climates, supportive climates based on equity. People working in a climate characterized by equity or equality tend to focus on equity rather than equality. They minimize status differences between everyone. Even though someone may be in charge, there's a limitation on the status differences. They feel respect for others. They don't set people up for failure. And they feel that each person is worthy, and decisions are made based on this regardless of status, power, or other external positions. And finally, the last set of climates, the defensive climate based on patterns of behavior that give off an idea of certainty. People working in a climate characterized by certainty tend to see others as dogmatic or rigid, see others as closed-minded, see others as having a fixation on their own way. My way or the highway, that's the cliche. Feel that alternative views are being blocked. Not much point in me offering anything here because people are certain and they're locked into their own dogma. Now, to counteract the defensive patterns of climates that are based on certainty is the supportive climates based on the patterns that are provisional in nature. And people working in a climate characterized by provisionalism tend to be tentative and flexible. There's not just one way. There's not just one solution. They sort of wait before responding. They're not reacting defensively. They make provisional statements like, we could possibly, or we might want to look at it. They tend to use active listening techniques and skills, and they tend to use qualifiers in a sense that in supportive language, like, well, one way we might consider looking at this situation is such and such, or from my perspective, it seems to me that such and such, or last time I looked, it was so and so. And they also tend to acknowledge views of others. Okay, so that is the 6 defensive climate patterns and the 6 supportive climate patterns. So what can we do with this information? Well, okay. The effects of climate on behavior and behavior on climate is a reciprocal process. Sort of like begets like. If you're polite to people, they're polite to you. If you're insensitive, they'll tend to be insensitive to you. As an example, individuals are operating within a certain climate. So let's say they're operating within a certain climate. Now, this existing climate affects the way people behave. So we have climate-produced behaviors. So this climate then creates certain behaviors within individuals. Now, these climate-producing behaviors result in the formation of a new climate. The new resulting climate shapes the individual behaviors, so we get behaviors produced by this new climate. And these new behaviors, now formed, produce another climate. And so it's a reciprocal process, and it's a very powerful one. And it goes on in a reciprocal nature. This is an extremely, extremely powerful tool, because if you intervene to change the climate, then you begin to change the behavior of the individuals within the climate. On the other hand, if you intervene to change the behavior of the individuals within a climate, you begin to change the climate itself. If you can control the climate, you can control the behavior of the individuals acting within the climate. So, you can do a little self-introspection. If you're in a situation and you're feeling defensive, you say, wow, what's going on here? Why am I feeling defensive? And if you can start to identify, well, then you can start to intervene in that defensive climate with behaviors that tend to produce more supportive situations. And eventually you may actually change that climate. So again, this is a tool that is extremely powerful. If you can control climate, you can control the behaviors of the people who are in the climate. On the other hand, if you can control the behaviors, or if you can change the behaviors of people that are operating within the climate, you can actually change the climate. And we have many tools that we've looked at through the course of the training modules. Effective communication skills that will counteract defensive climates. Appropriate eye contact and physical distance. You don't want to be, what's meant by that is you don't want to be right on top of the person like the Seinfeld episode, or you don't want to be too far away. So you want to have appropriate eye contact and appropriate body language, because we know body language and facial expression is responsible for more than 90% of what we want to communicate. So our body language and facial expressions are very important. Using silence effectively, that's an important communication skill. Silence can be very, very helpful. On the other hand, prolonged, extended silences can sometimes be very defense-producing, make people feel defensive. Other things that we've talked about are checking for understanding, paraphrasing, and all of the active listening skills. The use of iMessages we've talked about, the conflict resolution with win-win solutions, the concept of sphere of influence, and having people cognitively aware of just who is responsible for the problem and what things you can do, you have control over, and what things you don't. The use of summarizing, formative summaries and summative summaries. Formative summaries is an active listening skill. When you're in a conversation and an individual is talking and they've finished talking about one particular topic, then you might use a formative summary, give a summary of what they were talking about. Then they might go on and talk about another topic, and then a third topic, and then and at the end of the conversation, you may give a summative summary, which is a summary of all of the things that took place in the conversation. Very important communication skill. Another one is the use of encouragement. Statements like, please go on, or I see, or can you tell me a little more about that? These are all effective communication skills. Appropriate use of questioning. Now, questioning, most people think questioning is the best way to find out information. That's not necessarily so. Questioning can be a pain in the neck sometimes. You need to use questioning carefully and have a good understanding of what the questions you are asking. So these are all then effective communication skills that will help you if you would like to try and intervene in a climate that is defensive and try and move it to a more supportive nature. Well, that's it for this video. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to, in a minute, to turn off the video and go to pages 8, 9, and 10 in your worksheet and respond to the prompts there in writing. Now, these are challenging prompts, and they require you to synthesize information from previous videos as well as from this one. So I'd be very interested to see how you process these. Anyway, thank you very much for your time and consideration, and we'll see you in the next module.